Have you ever questioned everything you've been told about life, meaning, and morality? What if everything you thought gave your life purpose was actually an illusion? What if morality wasn't handed down by a divine power but something we create ourselves? What if the freedom you've always wanted came with a responsibility so heavy that most people would rather escape into comforting lies than embrace it? Welcome to the world of Simone de Beauvoir, one of the greatest existentialist thinkers of all time, who dared to challenge the foundations of religion, morality, and human purpose. In today's video, we'll dive into her groundbreaking ideas that continue to shape the very core of how we understand existence. This is not just a discussion about philosophy, this is about you. Your choices, your freedom, and the meaning you create for yourself. Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy isn't about nihilism, nor is it about atheism for the sake of atheism. It's about radical freedom, a terrifying yet exhilarating realization that no one is coming to define your life for you. There is no preordained path, no divine plan guiding your steps. You are free, but with that freedom comes the absolute responsibility to shape your own existence. Some might find this overwhelming. Others might find it liberating. But one thing is certain after watching this video. You'll never look at life the same way again. We'll explore how Beauvoir dismantled the idea that morality needs religion, why she rejected God without falling into despair, and how her insights into relationships, freedom, and personal responsibility can change the way you live. From history's greatest religious debates to today's search for meaning in a rapidly changing world, her philosophy is more relevant than ever. But before we dive into this mind-blowing discussion, take a moment to support this channel by hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these ideas. If you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video that challenges your mind and expands your perspective. If you find value in what we do, consider donating through Super Thanks or supporting the channel on Patreon. Your support keeps us going and allows us to create deep, thought-provoking content just like this. Now, buckle up, because we're about to question everything you thought you knew about morality, meaning, and existence. Let's get started. Simone de Beauvoir was a major existentialist thinker of the 20th century. Often associated with Jean-Paul Sartre, her ideas about existentialism and God challenge traditional notions of human nature, morality, and faith, unlike many religious traditions that assume a divine purpose for human existence. Beauvoir asserts that existence precedes essence, meaning that humans have no predefined nature or purpose. Instead, they create meaning through their choices and actions. This perspective aligns closely with Sartre's existentialist framework, in which individuals are responsible for defining themselves without relying on external authorities such as God or societal norms. Beauvoir's rejection of God was not an abrupt crisis but a gradual realization. As a child, she held strong religious beliefs, but over time, she stripped away aspects of her faith until nothing remained. This was not a moment of rebellion but a logical process of questioning and refining her understanding of reality. She observed that many people around her believed in God not because of solid reasoning but because of tradition, fear, or societal pressure. This led her to conclude that belief in God was unnecessary for morality or purpose in life. One of the key elements of existentialism, particularly in the thought of Beauvoir and Sartre, is the rejection of an external source of meaning. If God does not exist, then humans are entirely responsible for their own existence. This idea can be unsettling, as it removes the comfort of an absolute moral order or divine plan. However, Beauvoir saw this as a form of liberation. Without God, humans are free to shape their own values and destinies rather than being bound by doctrines imposed by religion or tradition. A common criticism of atheism and existentialism is that they lead to nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning. However, Beauvoir argued that meaning does not have to be imposed from above, rather, it emerges from human interactions and personal commitments. In other words, the absence of God does not mean life is meaningless, it means that meaning must be actively created. A clear example of this can be found in literature and film, where protagonists often face crises of meaning. Consider a character like Rick Blaine in Casablanca, who starts as a cynical, self-interested man but ultimately finds meaning through love and sacrifice. His purpose is not predetermined but shaped by his choices. Much like Beauvoir's existentialist perspective on life, Another important aspect of Beauvoir's philosophy is the ethical dimension of existentialism. Without a divine moral law, people must construct their own ethical frameworks. For Beauvoir, this meant an emphasis on freedom, not only personal freedom but the freedom of others. She argued that no one can fully realize themselves without engaging with others, and that genuine freedom is only possible in a world where everyone has the opportunity to define their own lives. This idea underpins her feminist philosophy, particularly in The Second Sex, where she explores how women have historically been denied existential freedom by a patriarchal society. Consider the civil rights movement in the United States, where figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X sought to expand the freedom of oppressed groups. While King was motivated by religious convictions, the existentialist approach Beauvoir advocates would argue that justice and equality are worth pursuing regardless of divine command. Freedom is not granted from above, it must be fought for and created by people through collective action. Beauvoir's views on religion also reveal an interesting paradox within faith itself. She points out that religious believers interpret God according to their own perspectives and biases. For example, within Christianity, different sects and individuals have vastly different understandings of what God wants. Some use religion to justify war, colonialism, or oppression, while others use it to promote peace, justice, and liberation. This suggests that moral values do not inherently come from religion but rather from human interpretation. The fact that both abolitionists and slaveholders cited the Bible to support their respective causes is a clear example of this phenomenon. She also touches on the issue of proving or disproving God's existence. She argues that while one cannot definitively disprove God, the burden of proof lies with believers, just as we do not assume the existence of mythical creatures without evidence. We should not assume the existence of a deity without rational justification. This skeptical stance is shared by many atheists and agnostics, including thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who famously used the analogy of a celestial teapot. Just because something cannot be disproven does not mean we should believe in it without evidence. Despite her rejection of God, Beauvoir acknowledges the emotional and psychological role of faith. For many, religion provides comfort, community, and a sense of purpose. Soren Kierkegaard, a Christian existentialist, argued that faith is not about logical proof but a personal leap into the unknown. While Beauvoir respects this perspective, she ultimately sees faith as an emotional response rather than a rational necessity. From an existentialist standpoint, relying on faith can be seen as an escape from the anxiety of freedom and attempt to impose order on an indifferent universe. Beauvoir's ideas are deeply relevant today, especially in debates about morality and secular ethics. Many people still assume that morality requires a religious foundation. Yet societies with high levels of secularism, such as Scandinavia, tend to have lower crime rates and higher levels of social trust. This suggests that ethical behavior is not necessarily linked to religious belief but to broader social and cultural factors. In fact, some of the most ethical decisions people make, such as donating to charity, helping a stranger, or fighting for human rights, are often based on empathy and reason rather than religious doctrine. Another modern application of Beauvoir's philosophy is in the realm of personal identity. In a world where traditional structures are breaking down, individuals are more responsible than ever for defining their own paths. Whether in careers, relationships, or belief systems, people must navigate a complex landscape without relying on predetermined roles or divine guidance. This aligns with the existentialist view that we are the authors of our own lives. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from Beauvoir's existentialism is the idea that meaning and morality do not need to come from an external source. While some may find comfort in faith, others can find just as much purpose through relationships, creativity, activism, or personal growth. The challenge of existentialism is to embrace this freedom rather than fear it. Whether one believes in God or not, the responsibility of shaping a meaningful life ultimately lies with the individual. Her philosophy encourages people to face existence with courage and integrity, rather than seeking answers in doctrine. Beauvoir urges us to engage with the world as it is, to create our own values, and to take responsibility for the impact of our actions. This is not a pessimistic view, rather, it is an invitation to live authentically, by embracing the uncertainty of existence. we can find deeper fulfillment in the very act of creating our own meaning. Existentialism emphasizes human freedom, choice, and personal responsibility, unlike traditional views that assume people have an innate essence or purpose. Existentialists argue that existence precedes essence, meaning individuals define themselves through their actions. Simone de Beauvoir adopts this perspective, rejecting the idea that human value is derived from a higher power. Instead, she asserts that meaning is created through one's engagement with the world. This aligns with Jean-Paul Sartre's notion that humans are condemned to be free and must take full responsibility for their lives. In practical terms, this means that people cannot rely on external authorities such as religious institutions or cultural traditions to dictate their purpose. They must actively construct their own identities through the decisions they make. Beauvoir's rejection of God is a cornerstone of her existentialist philosophy. She recounts that, as a child, she held a deep faith, but over time, she gradually dismantled it. This was not a sudden crisis but a slow realization that God had no tangible role in her life. She observed that many people around her believed in God, not because of rational arguments, but due to habit, fear, or societal pressure. This led her to conclude that belief in God was unnecessary for morality or purpose. Her perspective challenges the traditional assumption that religion is the foundation of ethical behavior. If people only act morally because they fear divine punishment or seek heavenly rewards, their morality is externally imposed rather than genuinely chosen. A common argument against atheism is that it leads to nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning. However, Beauvoir counters that meaning is not something imposed from above but something that emerges from human experience. The idea that life would be meaningless without God assumes that meaning must come from an external source. Existentialists reject this, asserting that meaning is created through relationships, commitments, and personal pursuits. This perspective is reflected in popular culture, where many films and books explore characters who find purpose without relying on divine guidance. In The Shawshank Redemption, for example, Andy Dufresne finds meaning through resilience, knowledge, and friendship. Despite suffering injustice and despair, his transformation illustrates the existentialist idea that meaning is something we construct, rather than something preordained. Ethically, Beauvoir argues that without a divine moral law, people must create their own ethical frameworks. She emphasizes the importance of freedom, not just personal freedom, but also the freedom of others. In her view, true morality involves recognizing and supporting the autonomy of all people. This perspective underlies her feminist philosophy, particularly in The Second Sex, where she critiques how society historically denied women the ability to define themselves. She argues that oppressive structures force women into predefined roles, stripping them of existential freedom. The idea that one's identity is shaped by choice rather than predetermined roles remains relevant today in discussions about gender, race, and social expectations. A real-world example of Beauvoir's ethical framework can be seen in civil rights movements. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X sought to expand freedom for oppressed communities. While King was motivated by religious convictions, the existentialist perspective Beauvoir advocates suggests that justice and equality are worth pursuing regardless of divine command. Freedom is not something granted from above, it must be actively created and defended by people. This idea applies to many modern social movements, from LGBTQ+ rights to environmental activism, where individuals and groups work to create a more just society based on human values rather than religious mandates. Beauvoir also critiques the way religious belief often reflects human biases rather than objective moral truths. She points out that different religious traditions and even different sects within the same religion interpret God's will in vastly different ways. For example, within Christianity, some groups use religion to justify war, colonialism, or social hierarchies, while others use it to promote peace, justice, and liberation. This suggests that moral values do not necessarily come from religion itself but rather from human interpretation. The fact that both abolitionists and slaveholders in the 19th century used the Bible to support their opposing positions highlights how religious morality is shaped by human perspectives. A key challenge for atheism is addressing the argument that God's existence cannot be definitively disproven. Beauvoir acknowledges this but argues that the burden of proof lies with believers. just as we do not assume the existence of mythical creatures without evidence. We should not assume the existence of a deity without rational justification. This skeptical stance is echoed by thinkers like Bertrand Russell, who famously used the analogy of a celestial teapot. Just because something cannot be disproven does not mean we should believe in it without evidence. Despite her rejection of God, Beauvoir recognizes the psychological and emotional role of faith. Many people find comfort, community, and purpose in religion. Soren Kierkegaard, a Christian existentialist, argued that faith is not about logical proof but a deeply personal leap into the unknown. While Beauvoir respects this perspective, she ultimately sees faith as an emotional response rather than a rational necessity. From an existentialist standpoint, relying on faith can be viewed as an attempt to impose order on an indifferent universe rather than embracing the challenge of freedom. Her philosophy remains highly relevant today, particularly in debates about secular morality. Many societies continue to assume that ethical behavior requires a religious foundation. However, highly secular countries such as Sweden and Denmark consistently rank among the most peaceful and socially just nations. This suggests that morality is not necessarily linked to religious belief but is instead influenced by social and cultural factors. Studies show that empathy, education, and community engagement are strong predictors of ethical behavior, supporting Beauvoir's argument that morality can be built on humanistic principles rather than divine commandments. Another contemporary application of Beauvoir's existentialism is in discussions of personal identity. In an era where traditional roles and structures are increasingly being questioned, individuals have greater responsibility for defining their own paths. Whether in careers, relationships, or belief systems, people must navigate a complex world without relying on predetermined roles or divine guidance. This aligns with the existentialist idea that we are the authors of our own lives. The rise of self-help literature and personal development movements reflects this shift, encouraging people to take responsibility for their own growth and fulfillment rather than seeking external validation. Perhaps the most significant lesson from Beauvoir's existentialism is that meaning and morality do not need to come from an external source. While faith provides comfort for many, others can find just as much purpose through relationships, creativity, activism, or intellectual pursuits. The challenge of existentialism is to embrace this freedom rather than fear it. Whether one believes in God or not, the responsibility of shaping a meaningful life ultimately rests with the individual. Beauvoir's philosophy encourages people to face existence with courage and integrity, rather than seeking answers in doctrine. She urges us to engage with the world as it is, to create our own values, and to take responsibility for our actions. This perspective is not one of despair but of empowerment. By accepting the uncertainty of existence, we can find deeper fulfillment in the act of creating our own meaning. If God does not exist, what guides human actions? Beauvoir argues that each individual is responsible for themselves and others. Two fundamental motivations drive human behavior: concern for others and the pursuit of personal happiness. These two elements are not separate but deeply interconnected. She believes that people can only truly realize themselves through their relationships with others. This idea challenges the assumption that atheism leads to nihilism. Throughout history, there have been many examples of individuals who lived ethical, meaningful lives without religious belief. Take Albert Camus, for instance. Despite being an atheist, Camus dedicated his life to fighting injustice, particularly during World War II, when he participated in the French Resistance. His novel The Plague illustrates that people can act morally and selflessly even without faith in God. The story follows a group of individuals responding to a deadly epidemic, making sacrifices for the common good despite knowing that their efforts may ultimately be in vain. This reflects Beauvoir's assertion that morality does not require a divine foundation. Many argue that without belief in God, people have no reason to behave morally. However, empirical evidence suggests otherwise. Countries with high levels of secularism, such as Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, consistently rank among the most ethical and peaceful societies. They have low crime rates, high levels of social trust, and strong welfare systems. If morality were entirely dependent on religion, one would expect these societies to be chaotic. Yet the opposite is true. Instead, social cooperation, empathy, and rational ethics guide human interactions. People help others not because of divine commandments but because they recognize the intrinsic value of kindness and cooperation. Some may counter that religion provides a necessary structure for moral behavior, particularly in guiding people through difficult ethical dilemmas. Yet moral reasoning does not always align with religious teachings. Throughout history, religious institutions have justified slavery, oppression, and discrimination. While some believers used faith to fight against these injustices, others used it to support them. This suggests that morality is not derived solely from religion but is instead shaped by human interpretation. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi were inspired by religious beliefs, but their advocacy for justice stemmed from broader ethical principles of equality and human dignity, values that can exist independently of religious doctrine. Beauvoir emphasizes that ethical behavior is a choice. People do not need divine authority to tell them that murder, theft, and dishonesty are wrong. Most societies have developed moral codes not because of religious teachings but because cooperation and mutual respect are essential for survival. The Golden Rule, which advises treating others as one wishes to be treated, is found in numerous cultures and philosophical traditions, including those that predate Christianity. This suggests that morality is a human construct rather than a divine one. Modern psychology also supports the idea that morality exists outside of religion. Studies on child development show that even infants exhibit a sense of fairness and empathy before they are exposed to religious teachings. Experiments in behavioral science demonstrate that people are more likely to behave ethically when they feel a sense of connection to others, rather than out of fear of punishment or hope for reward. This aligns with Beauvoir's argument that humans are responsible for shaping their own moral frameworks. If religion is not the foundation of morality, then what is? Beauvoir suggests that meaning arises from personal commitments, relationships, and engagement with the world. People find purpose through love, work, creative expression, and social activism. Consider Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, in which he describes how prisoners in Nazi concentration camps maintained a sense of purpose despite their suffering. Frankl, though religious, did not argue that faith alone sustained people. Instead, he found that those who survived often did so because they had personal reasons to keep going, whether it was family, unfinished work, or a desire to bear witness to history. This reinforces Beauvoir's argument that meaning is something we create, rather than something handed down from above. The idea that purpose must come from within rather than from a divine source is evident in modern existential struggles. Many people today face crises of identity, career uncertainty, and the pressures of an increasingly complex world. Rather than relying on religious dogma, individuals are expected to navigate these challenges on their own. This shift is evident in the popularity of self-help literature, mindfulness practices, and therapy, all of which emphasize personal responsibility and self-awareness rather than external salvation. Take the example of Steve Jobs. He was not particularly religious, yet he found profound meaning in his work, believing that technology could change the world. His dedication to creativity and innovation demonstrates that a sense of purpose does not require religious faith. Similarly, many scientists devote their lives to understanding the universe, driven not by divine commands but by a deep curiosity about the world. Figures like Carl Sagan and Richard Feynman were known for their awe of nature and the cosmos, but they derived meaning from discovery rather than theology. Some argue that atheism leads to despair, as it forces people to confront the reality of a universe without inherent meaning. However, Beauvoir and other existentialists see this not as a cause for despair but as an opportunity for freedom. If there is no preordained plan, then individuals have the power to shape their own destinies. This idea is empowering rather than nihilistic. Consider the case of individuals who leave strict religious communities and rebuild their lives according to their own values. Many report feelings of liberation and fulfillment, even though the transition can be difficult. They are no longer bound by rigid doctrines but can explore the world on their own terms. Another argument in favor of religion is that it provides comfort in the face of death. The promise of an afterlife eases existential anxiety, whereas atheism forces individuals to confront their mortality directly. Yet many non-religious people find peace in the idea that life is finite. They argue that meaning comes from making the most of the time we have, rather than waiting for a reward in the next life. This perspective is reflected in cultural works like Dead Poets Society, in which the phrase carpe diem, seize the day, encourages individuals to embrace life fully. Beauvoir's perspective remains relevant in today's world, where increasing secularization has led many to question traditional religious narratives. While some fear that a godless world lacks moral structure, real-world evidence suggests that people are capable of living ethical, fulfilling lives without divine guidance. The rise of humanist organizations, secular charities, and moral philosophy courses reflects a growing recognition that morality is not exclusive to religion. Ultimately, Beauvoir's existentialist philosophy challenges individuals to take responsibility for their own actions and to find meaning on their own terms. This can be a daunting task, but it is also profoundly liberating. Whether one believes in God or not, the responsibility for shaping a meaningful life ultimately rests with the individual. This perspective is not one of despair but of empowerment. By accepting that meaning is something we create, we open ourselves to the possibility of living with greater authenticity and purpose. Beauvoir argues that religion is not a monolithic system but rather a complex and evolving construct that people interpret in vastly different ways. Throughout history, religious belief has been used both to justify oppression and to fight against it. Some believers invoke faith as a means of reinforcing social hierarchies, while others use it as a source of inspiration for justice and equality. This diversity within religious traditions suggests that faith is not inherently a moral guide but rather a tool that can be shaped by human intentions. Consider how religious interpretations have varied on major social issues. In the United States, Christianity played a role on both sides of the slavery debate. Slave owners cited biblical passages to justify the institution, arguing that slavery was part of the natural order. At the same time, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe used Christianity to argue for the inherent dignity and equality of all people. The same scriptures were wielded to support entirely opposite ethical stances. This pattern repeats throughout history. Whether in debates over civil rights, women's rights, or LGBTQ+ rights, Beauvoir highlights that if morality were truly dictated by divine will, then there should be a clear and consistent ethical code derived from religion. However, the fact that religious followers disagree so widely on fundamental moral issues indicates that moral reasoning does not originate from faith itself. Instead, people bring their own social, political, and cultural biases to their interpretation of religious texts. Even within the same tradition, believers often reach radically different conclusions about issues like war, poverty, and human rights. A powerful example of this is Martin Luther King Jr. versus the religious leaders who opposed him. King was deeply inspired by his Christian faith, using biblical principles to advocate for nonviolent resistance and social justice. He believed that true Christianity required fighting for the oppressed and promoting equality. Yet at the same time, many of his most vocal opponents were also devout Christians who argued that racial segregation was divinely ordained. If religion were an objective source of morality, such contradictions should not exist. But they do repeatedly because people interpret religious teachings based on their existing worldviews rather than receiving a universal moral truth. This subjectivity in religious morality extends beyond Christianity. In Islam, interpretations of the Quran vary widely. Some Muslims advocate for a progressive, humanistic interpretation that emphasizes peace and coexistence, while others adhere to more rigid, fundamentalist views that justify gender inequality or religious persecution. Hinduism, which contains a vast array of beliefs, has been used both to promote nonviolence and to justify the caste system. Judaism, too, has strands that emphasize social justice and others that support rigid orthodoxy. The inconsistency across and within religions suggests that faith is not a singular moral authority but a framework that people adapt to fit their needs. Beauvoir challenges the idea that belief in God is necessary for ethical behavior. If morality were dictated by divine command, then non-believers should be less ethical than believers. However, research shows that secular societies often have lower crime rates, greater gender equality, and stronger social support systems than highly religious ones. In countries like Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands where religious belief is declining, there are still high levels of trust, charity, and social cooperation. Conversely, some of the most religious nations, including those with strict theocratic governments, struggle with corruption, violence, and human rights abuses. This contradicts the claim that morality is inherently linked to faith. A common defense of religion as a moral authority is the claim that without God, people would have no incentive to behave ethically. Beauvoir rejects this argument, asserting that morality comes from human responsibility, empathy, and rational thought. People do not need divine commandments to understand that murder, theft, and deception are wrong. Societies develop ethical norms based on mutual benefit and collective well-being. Even in ancient civilizations before the rise of monotheism, codes of conduct existed to regulate social behavior. The idea that morality must be derived from religion ignores the broader historical reality of ethical evolution. Modern psychology supports Beauvoir's argument that moral instincts exist independently of religious instruction. Studies on child development show that even infants demonstrate a basic sense of fairness and empathy before they are exposed to religious teachings. Experiments in behavioral ethics reveal that people are more likely to act morally when they feel connected to others, rather than when they are motivated by fear of punishment or promise of reward. This suggests that morality is rooted in human nature rather than divine law. If morality does not come from God, then where does it come from? Beauvoir asserts that ethical responsibility arises from human agency. People must take ownership of their actions rather than relying on external authorities to dictate right and wrong. This existentialist view challenges individuals to engage with the world thoughtfully, recognizing that ethical decisions require critical thinking and personal accountability. In this sense, morality becomes an active, conscious practice rather than a passive adherence to religious doctrine. One of the strongest counter-arguments to Beauvoir's view is that religion provides a moral structure that prevents chaos and relativism. If individuals are left to define morality for themselves, does that not open the door to subjective ethics where anything goes? Beauvoir responds that while moral decisions are subjective, that does not mean they are arbitrary. Ethical principles can be grounded in shared human experiences, the recognition of suffering, and the need for social cooperation. Just as laws evolve to reflect societal values, moral reasoning develops in response to cultural and historical contexts. Consider the shift in attitudes towards same-sex marriage. For centuries, many religious traditions condemned homosexuality as immoral. Yet over time, social perspectives changed as people recognized that love and commitment are not exclusive to heterosexual relationships. Even within religious communities, many believers adjusted their views, suggesting that morality is not fixed but shaped by human experience. This aligns with Beauvoir's argument that ethical reasoning is not dictated by divine will but by human understanding and evolution. Another example is the death penalty. Some religious texts support capital punishment, while others advocate for mercy and forgiveness. Across the world, attitudes toward the death penalty vary widely, even among religious populations. The fact that believers disagree on such a fundamental issue underscores Beauvoir's point that morality is not handed down from God but constructed through cultural, legal, and philosophical dialogue. Beauvoir also critiques how religion has been used to maintain power structures. Historically, religious institutions have reinforced gender roles, social hierarchies, and political authority. Women have been told that their subordination is divinely ordained, and rulers have justified their authority as being granted by God. These claims serve to protect existing power dynamics rather than to provide moral guidance. The idea that morality requires religion often benefits those in control rather than promoting genuine ethical progress. Yet it is important to acknowledge that religion is not solely a tool for oppression. Many believers use faith as a source of resilience and moral guidance in positive ways. Figures like Dorothy Day, Desmond Tutu, and the Dalai Lama have drawn upon religious principles to advocate for justice and compassion. This does not negate Beauvoir's argument but rather reinforces that religion is a human construct that can be interpreted for good or ill. The fact that faith can inspire both liberation and oppression suggests that morality exists beyond religious doctrine. Ultimately, Beauvoir challenges the assumption that religion is the foundation of ethical behavior. She argues that moral reasoning is a human responsibility, not a divine mandate. History, psychology, and social research support her view, showing that morality is influenced by cultural evolution, empathy, and rational discourse rather than by religious belief alone. While faith can be a source of comfort and meaning for many, it is not the sole determinant of ethical behavior. By recognizing that morality is constructed through human experience, individuals gain the freedom to engage with ethical questions more critically and responsibly. The question of whether God exists is one of the oldest and most debated topics in philosophy. Beauvoir acknowledges that no one can definitively prove or disprove God's existence. But she insists that the burden of proof lies with the believer. If there is no compelling evidence for God's existence, then there is no logical reason to assume God is real any more than we assume the existence of invisible beings controlling our lives. This is a fundamental principle in philosophy known as the burden of proof, which states that the responsibility of providing evidence falls on the person making the claim. If someone asserts that an all-powerful deity exists, they must provide substantial proof rather than expecting skeptics to disprove something for which there is no verifiable evidence. Bertrand Russell made a famous analogy to illustrate this point. He proposed the idea of a celestial teapot orbiting the Sun between Earth and Mars. This teapot is too small to be detected by telescopes, but if someone claimed it existed, the burden of proof would be on them to demonstrate its reality, not on others to disprove it. The same logic applies to God. Just because something cannot be disproven does not make it reasonable to believe in it. If we accepted this reasoning, we would also have to take seriously the possibility of fairies, ghosts, or mythical deities from ancient religions. Beauvoir applies this thinking to faith, arguing that just because God's existence cannot be definitively disproven does not mean belief in God is justified. This does not mean that belief in God is inherently irrational, but it does highlight the challenge of basing one's worldview on something that lacks empirical evidence. Throughout history, philosophers and theologians have attempted to construct logical arguments for the existence of God, but none have been universally accepted. The ontological argument, proposed by Anselm of Canterbury, claims that because God is defined as the greatest possible being, he must exist. However, critics, including Immanuel Kant, have pointed out that defining something into existence is not a valid logical move. The cosmological argument, championed by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, argues that because everything has a cause, there must be a first cause, God. Yet this raises the question of why God himself does not require a cause. The teleological argument, or the argument from design, suggests that the complexity of the universe implies a designer. However, modern science offers natural explanations for complexity, from evolution to the formation of galaxies. Beauvoir recognizes that these arguments, while intellectually interesting, do not provide conclusive proof of God's existence. Even if they were persuasive, they do not necessarily point to a specific deity. If one accepts the idea of a first cause or a designer, why must it be the Christian God, or Allah, or any particular religious conception of God? The ambiguity of these arguments weakens their ability to serve as a foundation for faith. Moreover, as human knowledge expands, explanations that once required divine intervention, such as the origins of life or the movement of planets, are increasingly accounted for by natural processes. A different argument for belief in God comes from Søren Kierkegaard, who suggests that faith is not based on logic but on a deep existential need. He argues that belief in God requires a leap of faith, meaning that religious conviction is a personal and subjective choice rather than a matter of evidence. For Kierkegaard, faith is an emotional and spiritual commitment rather than a conclusion reached through reason. Many religious individuals resonate with this view, feeling that faith gives them purpose, comfort, and moral guidance. Beauvoir respects the complexity of religious belief but ultimately sees faith as a psychological response rather than a philosophical necessity. Humans have an inherent desire for meaning, security, and structure, and religion fulfills those needs. It offers explanations for existence, moral order, and an afterlife, providing solace in the face of uncertainty. However, just because something is comforting does not make it true. People often believe things that make them feel better, but that does not mean those beliefs reflect reality. An example of this can be seen in childhood beliefs. Many children believe in Santa Claus, not because they have solid evidence, but because it brings them joy and a sense of magic during the holiday season. Over time, as they grow and examine the world more critically, They abandon the belief in Santa while still appreciating the values associated with the tradition. Beauvoir suggests that religious faith operates in a similar way. It is emotionally satisfying. But this does not confirm its truth. People may hold on to religious beliefs for cultural or psychological reasons rather than because they are intellectually defensible. There is also the argument that belief in God is necessary for morality. But Beauvoir rejects this notion. She points out that people who do not believe in God are still capable of ethical behavior. Morality does not require divine commandments, it arises from human empathy, social cooperation, and rational thought. The idea that people would descend into immorality without belief in God assumes that humans lack an intrinsic sense of right and wrong. Yet societies throughout history, including secular societies, have established moral codes based on principles of justice, fairness, and compassion. Consider the case of Scandinavian countries, which are among the most secular in the world yet also rank highest in measures of social well-being, equality, and ethical governance. If religion were the foundation of morality, one would expect these societies to be deeply flawed, but they demonstrate that ethical living is possible without religious belief. Additionally, history is filled with examples of religious individuals committing acts of violence and oppression in the name of faith. From the Crusades to the Inquisition to modern-day extremism, religion has often been used to justify harm. This does not mean that all religious people are immoral, but it does challenge the assumption that faith inherently leads to goodness. Another way to examine belief in God is through the lens of existential anxiety. Many people fear the uncertainty of life and the finality of death. Religion provides answers to these fears by offering the promise of an afterlife, divine justice, and cosmic meaning. However, Beauvoir encourages people to confront the reality of existence rather than seeking comfort in unverifiable beliefs. She argues that embracing uncertainty can be liberating, rather than relying on an external authority to define purpose. Individuals have the freedom to create their own meaning. A parallel can be drawn to how people approach life goals. Some prefer structured paths with clear rules and expectations, such as following a religious doctrine or adhering to a strict career trajectory. Others prefer the freedom to explore, change paths, and define success on their own terms. Beauvoir aligns with the latter perspective, suggesting that existential freedom, while sometimes daunting, allows for a more authentic and fulfilling life. Pascal's wager is another common argument in favor of belief in God. Blaise Pascal argued that believing in God is the safest bet if God exists. The believer gains eternal reward, while the non-believer risks eternal punishment. If God does not exist, the believer loses nothing. However, Beauvoir and many other philosophers reject this reasoning. First, it assumes that belief is a matter of choice rather than conviction. One cannot simply decide to believe in something for pragmatic reasons. Second, it does not specify which God or religion to follow. If one chooses Christianity but Islam is correct, or vice versa, the wager fails. Third, it implies that faith should be motivated by self-interest rather than genuine conviction. This approach reduces belief to a strategic calculation rather than a sincere philosophical stance. Ultimately, Beauvoir challenges the assumption that belief in God is necessary for a meaningful or moral life. She acknowledges that faith can be deeply personal and fulfilling for many. But she does not see it as a requirement for ethical behavior or existential purpose. Rather than relying on divine authority, she encourages people to take responsibility for their own beliefs, actions, and values. This perspective aligns with the broader existentialist idea that meaning is not handed down from above but is something individuals must actively create. In modern discussions, her arguments remain relevant. With increasing secularization, more people are questioning the necessity of religious belief for morality and purpose. Studies show that atheists and agnostics can lead deeply meaningful lives, contributing to society in ways that reflect ethical principles grounded in reason and human compassion. Whether one believes in God or not, what matters is how one chooses to live. Beauvoir's existentialism does not demand atheism, but it does encourage a thoughtful, reflective approach to belief, one that does not rely on blind faith but on personal responsibility and intellectual honesty. Beauvoir emphasizes that freedom and responsibility go hand in hand, Existentialism rejects the notion that people are born with a predetermined purpose or essence. Instead, individuals must create their own meaning through actions and choices. This level of freedom can be unsettling, as it removes external authorities like God or destiny from the equation. However, with this freedom comes full responsibility. There is no higher force to blame for one's circumstances. If someone makes a mistake, they must own it. If they succeed, it is entirely because of their efforts. This concept resonates with modern self-help philosophies that encourage personal accountability, such as those promoted by figures like Jordan Peterson or Jocko Willink, who emphasize discipline and responsibility as key elements of a meaningful life. The idea that no one is coming to save you forces individuals to take control of their destiny. Whether in career, relationships, or personal development, Beauvoir challenges the assumption that morality requires religion. Many people are taught from a young age that ethical behavior stems from divine commandments, whether the 10 Commandments in Christianity or similar moral codes in other faiths. However, history and psychology suggest otherwise. Societies that are highly secular, such as those in Scandinavia, consistently rank among the most peaceful, least corrupt, and most socially responsible. If religion were the primary source of morality, these societies should be in chaos. Yet they function remarkably well with strong social trust and ethical standards. The argument that humans need God to behave morally assumes that people act ethically only out of fear of divine punishment or the promise of heavenly rewards. But research in moral psychology shows that fairness, empathy, and cooperation are deeply ingrained in human nature. Even young children, before being exposed to religious teachings, exhibit a sense of justice and concern for others. Studies by psychologists like Paul Bloom have shown that babies as young as 6 months old demonstrate a basic moral compass. This suggests that morality is not something dictated from above but rather an evolutionary trait that has helped human societies function. The idea that faith is a choice rather than a necessity is another crucial point in Beauvoir's philosophy. Many religious believers grow up in environments where faith is not presented as an option but as a fundamental truth. In some cultures, questioning or abandoning religion is seen as betrayal. However, Beauvoir argues that belief should be an act of choice, not a passive inheritance. If faith is to be meaningful, it must be something a person arrives at through personal reflection rather than societal pressure. This is why many people who leave strict religious backgrounds describe their journey as one of liberation. Consider individuals who grow up in fundamentalist households but later embrace secularism or a more open-ended spiritual outlook. Figures like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins have argued that the freedom to question and explore different perspectives is essential for intellectual honesty. Even within religious traditions, there are those who redefine their faith in more personal and less dogmatic ways. People like Rob Bell, a former evangelical pastor, have moved away from rigid doctrines in favor of a more open and flexible spirituality. Beauvoir's point is that faith should never be an imposed obligation but a deliberate and conscious decision. Relationships with others play a central role in shaping meaning. Unlike the nihilistic stereotype often associated with atheism or existentialism, Beauvoir does not argue that life is meaningless without God. Rather, she asserts that meaning is something people create together. A life lived in complete isolation is empty, whereas connections with others through love, friendship, family, and community give life depth and significance. Many of the most fulfilling human experiences are relational. A parent finds meaning in raising a child, a teacher in educating students, an artist in sharing their work with an audience. Even those who achieve great personal success often describe the greatest joys as being tied to relationships rather than material accomplishments. Consider the interviews of elderly individuals who reflect on their lives. Rarely do they say their greatest fulfillment came from money or status. More often, they speak of the people they loved, the friendships they cherished, and the contributions they made to others' lives. This aligns with modern psychological research on happiness, which consistently finds that strong social connections are one of the biggest predictors of long-term well-being. Beauvoir's existentialism, far from advocating for cold individualism, recognizes the fundamental importance of human bonds. Religion is not a single, unified force but a tool that can be used for both justice and oppression. History is filled with examples of religious teachings being interpreted in radically different ways. The same Christian Bible was used by both abolitionists and slaveholders in the 19th century. Martin Luther King Jr. drew upon his faith to advocate for civil rights, while segregationists justified racial inequality through religious doctrine. The Quran has been interpreted both as a source of peace and as a justification for violence. Hinduism has inspired both the philosophy of nonviolence promoted by Gandhi and the caste system that enforces rigid social divisions. Judaism has produced both deeply progressive movements and highly conservative sects. This inconsistency suggests that morality does not flow directly from religion but is instead shaped by cultural, political, and individual biases. Beauvoir points out that religious institutions often serve as mechanisms for maintaining social order rather than sources of pure ethical truth. Many religious doctrines reinforce existing power structures rather than challenge them. Women, for example, have been systematically excluded from leadership positions in many major religions. The Catholic Church, Orthodox Judaism, and conservative Islamic sects all restrict women's roles based on interpretations of divine will. Yet across different cultures and historical periods, feminist movements have challenged these religious restrictions and argued for gender equality. If morality were dictated solely by religion, these interpretations would not change, but they do constantly because moral reasoning is ultimately a human endeavor. Religious pluralism also complicates the notion that faith is necessary for morality. If belief in God were the only path to ethical behavior, then different religions should have wildly different moral codes. However, across cultures, there are common ethical principles, such as prohibitions against murder and theft and the promotion of kindness and reciprocity. This suggests that morality is not uniquely tied to one religious tradition but is instead a reflection of human social evolution. Secular humanism, which promotes ethical behavior based on reason and empathy rather than religious doctrine, has grown as an alternative moral framework. Many leading philanthropists, scientists, and social activists identify as secular yet dedicate their lives to improving the human condition. Figures like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, both non-religious, have donated billions to charitable causes, demonstrating that morality and generosity are not exclusive to the religious. Beauvoir's existentialism is not anti-religion but anti-passivity. She does not argue that belief in God is inherently bad, but she insists that people must take responsibility for their beliefs and actions. If someone chooses faith, it should be a conscious, examined choice rather than an unthinking acceptance of tradition. Likewise, if someone rejects faith, it should be because they have thoughtfully considered their worldview, not because they simply wish to rebel. Existential freedom means confronting one's beliefs honestly and making deliberate choices. This idea resonates with many people today, especially those who have grown up in religious environments but now question aspects of their faith. It also applies to those who remain religious but wish to practice their faith in a way that aligns with their own ethical values rather than rigid dogma. The growing trend of spiritual but not religious reflects this shift. People seek personal meaning rather than adhering to institutional authority. The success of books like The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle or Waking Up by Sam Harris shows a widespread interest in finding meaning outside of traditional religion. Ultimately, Beauvoir's philosophy challenges individuals to live authentically, whether one believes in God or not. What matters is taking responsibility for one's actions, engaging with others meaningfully, and shaping a moral life based on critical thought and genuine conviction. Her existentialism is not about despair but empowerment, the idea that we are free to create our own paths rather than follow preordained scripts. This freedom is not always easy, but it offers a more honest and fulfilling approach to existence. Beauvoir's philosophy challenges individuals to live authentically, taking full responsibility for their existence rather than relying on external authorities to define their worth. Whether one believes in God or not, what ultimately matters is how a person engages with the world and interacts with others. This perspective aligns with broader existentialist thought, which argues that meaning is not something given but something created through actions, choices, and relationships. In a world where people often seek validation from institutions, social norms, or religious doctrines, Beauvoir's ideas encourage self-reflection and personal accountability. Her existentialism rejects the notion that humans have a predetermined essence. Instead, identity is shaped through decisions and experiences. This concept resonates with modern discussions about personal growth, career choices, and relationships. Many people struggle with societal expectations, pressure to follow a specific career path, adhere to cultural traditions, or conform to conventional lifestyles. Beauvoir's perspective suggests that true fulfillment comes not from external approval but from actively shaping one's life in a way that aligns with personal values. The freedom to define oneself is both liberating and daunting, requiring individuals to take full responsibility for their successes and failures. This emphasis on personal responsibility extends to ethical behavior. Many assume that morality requires religious guidance, but Beauvoir argues that ethical living is possible without divine commandments. In fact, true morality is most meaningful when it is chosen rather than imposed. This idea is supported by psychological research showing that people behave ethically not because of religious beliefs but because of empathy, social bonds, and rational considerations. Countries with high levels of secularism, such as Sweden and Denmark, have strong social welfare systems, low crime rates, and high levels of trust among citizens. This contradicts the assumption that societies need religion to maintain order and moral integrity. Beauvoir also highlights the importance of human relationships in shaping meaning. Life gains significance not from abstract theological concepts but from genuine connections with others. Love, friendship, family, and community provide a sense of purpose that is more tangible than any religious doctrine. This idea is echoed in modern psychology, where studies consistently show that strong social ties are the biggest predictor of happiness and well-being. Consider how people often find meaning in raising children, mentoring others, or engaging in acts of kindness. These relationships and actions contribute more to a fulfilling life than adherence to rigid belief systems. Her ideas are particularly relevant in a world increasingly defined by uncertainty. Traditional structures of meaning, religion, nationalism, fixed gender roles are being questioned and redefined. More people are seeking alternative ways to find purpose, whether through creative expression, activism, or personal exploration. The growing popularity of mindfulness, self-help movements, and secular ethics suggests a shift toward an existentialist approach to meaning-making. People are learning to navigate life without relying on predetermined scripts, embracing the freedom and responsibility that come with it. Beauvoir's challenge to external authorities extends beyond religion to all forms of imposed meaning. She critiques societal norms that dictate how individuals should live, arguing that true authenticity requires questioning inherited values. This perspective is especially relevant in conversations about gender, race, and social justice. Many traditional roles and expectations were created to serve specific power structures rather than individual well-being. Beauvoir's existentialism urges people to critically examine these roles and redefine them on their own terms. Her emphasis on courage in the face of existential anxiety is another key takeaway. Many people fear the uncertainty of existence, seeking comfort in religious promises of an afterlife or fate-driven narratives. But Beauvoir suggests that rather than fearing uncertainty, people should embrace it as an opportunity to shape their own paths. This perspective is empowering because it shifts focus from external forces to personal agency. Whether in career changes, relationships, or philosophical beliefs, the ability to accept and navigate uncertainty leads to a more dynamic and engaged life. The idea that people must confront existence with integrity rather than escape into illusions is a recurring theme in existentialist literature. In literature and film, many compelling characters embody this struggle. Rick Blaine in Casablanca initially adopts a detached, cynical attitude but ultimately chooses to act according to his values. Neo in The Matrix begins as a passive participant in a constructed reality but takes control of his destiny by embracing truth and self-discovery. These stories resonate because they reflect the fundamental existentialist challenge, to engage fully with reality rather than seek comfort in false narratives. Beauvoir's existentialism also has significant implications for contemporary social issues. In a world grappling with political polarization, economic inequality, and environmental crises, her call for personal and collective responsibility is more relevant than ever. Rather than looking to divine intervention or waiting for institutions to solve problems, people must take active roles in shaping a just society. Social movements that push for change, whether in racial justice, gender equality, or climate action, embody this philosophy. The individuals leading these movements are not waiting for a higher power to dictate their purpose, they're creating it through action. Her work also speaks to the struggles of those who break away from restrictive belief systems. Many people raised in rigid religious or ideological environments experience a deep existential crisis when they begin questioning their beliefs. The loss of an externally imposed meaning can be disorienting, but Beauvoir's philosophy provides a framework for rebuilding meaning on one's own terms. Instead of relying on inherited beliefs, individuals can construct new values based on lived experience, reason, and authentic relationships. This process is not easy, but it is ultimately more fulfilling than passive acceptance of dogma. Beauvoir's rejection of passive faith does not mean she dismisses spirituality altogether. Many people find meaning in spiritual practices without adhering to a rigid religious framework. Meditation, philosophical reflection, and artistic expression all offer ways to engage with the deeper aspects of human existence. What she critiques is blind obedience to unexamined beliefs. Whether one chooses to believe in God or not, the key is to approach belief thoughtfully and deliberately, rather than as an inherited assumption. Her ideas also have implications for how people approach death. Many religious traditions offer the comfort of an afterlife, while existentialism forces individuals to confront mortality directly. While this can be unsettling, it also reinforces the urgency of living fully in the present, instead of postponing fulfillment for an afterlife. Existentialist thought encourages people to create meaning here and now. This mindset is reflected in philosophies like Stoicism, which also emphasize accepting the finite nature of life and making the most of the time we have. Beauvoir's philosophy is not about rejecting faith for the sake of rejection, but about embracing the freedom to question, define, and create. This perspective is particularly appealing in an age where access to information allows people to explore different worldviews, challenge traditions, and craft individualized belief systems. The ability to think critically about existence is one of the defining traits of human consciousness. And Beauvoir's existentialism fully embraces this capacity. Her work also serves as a reminder that meaning is not something to be passively received but actively built. This is a valuable perspective in a world where many feel lost or directionless. Rather than searching for meaning outside themselves, individuals have the power to shape their own narratives. This is why existentialist thought continues to resonate, particularly among those seeking purpose beyond conventional structures. Whether applied to personal development, ethical decision-making, or social activism, Beauvoir's ideas encourage people to live with intention. By rejecting preordained meaning and embracing the responsibility of self-definition, individuals can lead richer, more authentic lives. The challenge she presents is not an easy one, but it is one that ultimately leads to greater freedom, fulfillment, and integrity. So, what does it mean to live authentically? Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a challenge. A challenge to take full responsibility for your life, to refuse to be a passive participant in your own existence. There's no God or divine force that dictates the meaning of your life. You create it every single day, through the choices you make. That might sound terrifying, but it's also empowering. You have the freedom to define yourself, to shape your values, to create purpose where none was given. But the question remains, what will you do with that freedom? Will you embrace it, face the uncertainty, and live deliberately? Or will you retreat into the comfort of preordained answers, letting others decide what your life should mean? This is your moment to reflect, to challenge your own beliefs, and to take control of your narrative. Beauvoir's existentialism doesn't promise an easy life. It doesn't give you comforting illusions. What it offers is something far greater: the power to live a life of integrity, authenticity, and purpose on your own terms. And that is a power worth embracing. If this video made you think, if it challenged your assumptions, if it forced you to look at life differently, then let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you believe meaning can exist without God? Have you ever faced an existential crisis? And how did you come out of it? Let's dive into these deep questions together. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss content that expands your mind. If you believe in what we do here, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks donation or joining our Patreon community. Every contribution helps us bring more groundbreaking ideas to life and keeps this conversation going. This is just the beginning. Keep questioning, keep exploring, keep thinking. See you in the next video.